You see, the purpose of this video is very selfless. I am being very generous to my viewers. Why? Because unlike many content creators that talk about WoW, I like to show my content whenever I'm making a video, you know, to actually show that I play the game, rather than just talking about it without actually engaging with the content. So you can see I know somewhat what I'm talking about, right? And some of these things include Mythic Plus, right? So there's a problem in Mythic Plus. The higher you go in keys, the more I show my footage of keys on my shaman or on my paladin. Eventually my viewers will start getting abused by a constant, relentless storm of rain of fires dropping down on the screen, and that happens because Destruction Warlocks are everywhere, and they will also never stop being able to avoid seeing survival hunters in their groups. So me being generous and me thinking about you, I have to make this video as a plea to Blizzard to start nerfing these two specs. Stat. Okay? I don't want to have to see two of these in every single dungeon every time. It starts to get boring, okay? Please. Even when we go, let's just move over to Radar.io. We look at all of the keys, all of the classes and specs. It looks quite even, it looks quite balanced, right? It's not even that bad. But then you start looking in the higher range, right? You start going into the 20 and up, not even the plus 25, just the plus 20. You start looking at tanks and you're like, well, you know, it's balanced, right? If I'm playing my own tank, of course, it's only gonna be Prot Paladin. But if you see, when I play a healer, it's pretty much random which tank I'm getting. It's a BDK, sure, but it can also be very often a Prot Paladin, a Monk, a Druid. I've had them all, except for the brown thing over there. And then when you go to healer, it's the same. Yes, the other priest we don't talk about and Mistweaver are kind of dead, but when I'm tanking, I have seen all shares of healers. It's quite diverse, it's quite often varied. But then you go to the melee DPS and it starts to get a little bit heavy, right? A little bit repetitive, because survival starts being in about 1/4 of all of your keys if you're looking for a melee DPS, and in my experience that's even higher than this looks. In my experience, keys higher than 20 very often have had a melee DPS being survival, so it gets quite repetitive. I start missing seeing some specs, right, like Unholy Death Knight, Red Paladin. Okay, well, Feral Druid I've never seen, but you know, it starts getting a little bit repetitive. And then there is the absolute disaster that is the range DPS spot, because this is where things start getting a little bit on the repetitive level. We have pointed out how Destruction in the highest of keys broke the 50% mark a couple of weeks ago. Last week we mentioned how Destruction broke the 51% mark, and this week they are almost approaching the 52% mark. So perhaps that's already what you're gonna be seeing our next Mythic Plus recap video, the absolute abomination that is Destruction, right? This season basically I've not had, as a tank or as a healer, I've not seen Shadow Priest in my group, like ever, barely ever seen an Elemental Shaman, so it gets tiring and it gets repetitive, and I want this to change. Now, how can this change? This is not some great massive hurdle that Blizzard has to go through. You can change it by nerfing them, because the main power of Destruction is their absolute absurd AoE power. It's not that they are needed, it's not like BFA, Shroud, Rogue level of needed, it's not that they are needed for some kind of tech in Mythic Plus, they are just there for the damage. The utility of Warlock is not particularly powerful in Mythic Plus. You know, Gateways and Hellstones are a much more powerful asset in Red Encounters. In Mythic Plus, not nearly as much. They are just there for the AoE damage. So nerf their AoE damage. There are other specs that supposedly can have lots of AoE damage. Elemental, Frost Mage come to mind as range DPS for starters. When you go to melee, it's the same. It's survival, which is there for almost exclusively their AoE damage. They have very little utility. They are very squishy. So they are just there for the AoE damage. In the melee camp, Red Paladin, Havoc Demon Hunter, Windwalker Monk, Unholy Death Knight, or nowadays likely Frost Death Knight, are all pretty good on their AoE side of things, so just nerf their damage. Just put them back in line and straighten out the balance, right? Of course, this might hurt the 0.001% of players, right? The players that are currently pushing 32 and getting into 33 keys. If you nerf these two abomination of specs back to being average, you will not be able to push 32 and 33 keys anymore because you will not have the damage anymore. But it will definitely be better for 99.9999% of the player base, right? Some of the things you see here are just unacceptable. Yeah, you see this key, for example. Where is this one? This one right here. You see this heroic monk being able to be the best in his bracket of monks in a +30 necrotic wake, and he is barely at the same level of a 50 percentile logging survival hunter. That's not good. Not to mention he is also some 10% behind a 50 percentile logging Destruction Warlock. This perfectly encapsulates the current problem that the DPS have when it comes to AoE damage in Mythic plus keys. The same thing can go in pretty much everywhere else you look. You look at this other heroic Windwalker monk trying super hard to break the 25,000 barrier. Meanwhile, you have even a just moderately good warlock just blasting in completely in terms of DPS. I don't think this is acceptable in any way. I don't think this should be allowed to stay in this state for so long is my problem. We are now well over 3 months into the tier. We have now gotten into the situation since quite a while ago. And you know, this to me is no longer acceptable. When you see literally like the best parsing outlaw rogue in a Plagueful key having 19,000 DPS when one of the better parsing warlocks is at 27,000, like what is this? This should not be allowed, right? It should be allowed in some extreme cases, like, oh, this is the specific single target spec feral druid trying to AoE against the specific AoE spec elemental shaman, right? And an elemental is doubling their DPS in AoE. Fine, that's expected. But this is not really happening. You know, this is like properly good and decent AoE specs like we have seen with Windwalker monks getting smoked in AoE damage compared to warlocks, for example. So this, I just don't think it's acceptable to stay at this level for this long. And I don't have any horse in this race, by the way. I am a tank and a healer. So basically, I am an observer in this fight. I'm just looking from outside and drawing my conclusions based on what I've seen. And what I have seen is being sick of seeing the same two specs over and over. It might also not help too much that these specs are also ridiculously boring to play, and just basically sometimes you enjoy seeing a good DPS because you acknowledge that it is difficult to min-max how to play that spec. So you see a top DPS, you're like, man, that guy is a Chad. You know, he's really playing the class to perfection. He knows what to do every time. But when you look at this even middling warlock with 26,000 DPS, still far above the rest, and you look at his casts in a timeline spread, you will see that the overall casts are going to be just this. You know, it's just going to be a whole wave of Rain of Fires over and over. Eventually, there's going to be some single target periods where you get to use some Chaos Bolts, but for the most part it's just going to be Rain of Fire spam over and over. And that's just, you know, that's probably what feels even worse, right? It's not that this guy is being top damage because he is min-maxing his rotation to perfection. It's even a brain dead spec that takes no effort or skill whatsoever. Not to mention perhaps another thing I have seen quite often being complained by players is the flavor of the month status that these two specs have achieved, survival and destruction. So many players have now gotten to see some players who are definitely not belonging to the ranking that they are supposed to be in because of the spec they have been playing has definitely and significantly inflated their rating, their value as players. You know, TLDR, they were mediocre mage players who suddenly reroll to Destruction, they press Rain of Fire, and they can get invited to 3.5k rating keys, even though they are definitely not nearly as good as that level. That is also something I've seen being complained quite often. More and more often you see, because you see so many of these survival hunters or Destrolocks being invited to keys, you often get to see as a result many players who are definitely not masters of the spec, definitely not experienced mains at the spec, but they quite often fall for some obvious mistakes because they're not really that good at playing the spec. They're just getting carried by the status of the spec that it has had for in this tier for so long. So that was my rant for today, because season 4 is approaching. We have seen some voices in corridors, you know, some whispers in the shadows about season 4 coming in close-ish, especially perhaps given the serious amount of nerfs that the Blizzard has been giving to the raid, right? These set of nerfs, one after the other, so quick in succession, are quite weird. You know, it's almost as if Blizzard is trying to accelerate the slow process of progressing in this tier because they wanted the next season to come out somewhat early. So with the next season closing in, I really want some type of balancing to come through, and even if this next season is like 2 months away, I would like the balance tuning still to make it early, preferably in about a day, preferably this reset, because I've just grown sick and tired of seeing these two specs over and over. I don't particularly like them. I don't particularly like that they are too simple to play. I don't particularly like that it's just so much more, right? That is perhaps also another reason why so many people are not as into these specs. You know, let's go back to season 2. You had a much more even split. You didn't have the 35 plus 40% single spec. You had Windwalker being brought, you had Havoc being brought, you had both warrior specs being brought. All of the rogues as a whole were just making up also for a good percentage of players in high keys. And for the range DPS, look at this beauty. You know, you had the supposed hopium idea of Elemental Shaman becoming quite meta in season 2. Then you had still Balanced Druid doing quite well. You had Fire Mage still being the most played one, and then Hunters as always very popular. Warlock, ironically, was not as popular overall, but it was still much more balanced than what we had now. Even the flavor of the month specs, even the Balanced Druid or the Fire Mage, were nowhere near the level of power we have seen now these two specs having. And then if we go back to season 1, in melee DPS you still had the split, which was very similar to what we had the next season of Warrior, Rogue, Windwalker and Havoc. And for range DPS you had, that was the main strongest divide and dominance, the Fire Mage and Balanced Druid duo in season 1. None of this, however, is even remotely close to the level of dominance we have seen this season from both Destruction and Survival. So that is perhaps also another problem that players had in this tier. They put up with other specs in this expansion being meta, because even though they were the meta specs, even though they were the flavor of the month specs, they were not nearly as oppressive to everyone else. This rant video was to point out that I wish we get some impending, quick and imminent balance tuning for these two AoE specs. I don't know how you balance them, just tone down their AoE. Some people will complain, but you have to just remind them of things like this. They can't really complain when you are put in front of reality, which is that getting nerfed by 30% looks like a gigantic nerf, looks incredible, looks like unviable, yet 30% would put you at the same level of a survival hunter as a warlock. TLDR, you had your fun, you had your 3 months of meta without really any competition for your roles in the melee and range spot, but now it's time to stop. Now it's time to get a nerf, a heavy nerf, none of that weak shit we have gotten so far, because it clearly has not worked. So that is my wish to see very soon in terms of balancing of specs. I'm happy. I'm just gonna close saying that I'm happy about the buffs that some of the specs received. Many people have been memeing about the low level of the buffs that these specs have received, or the fact that they don't really do too much. Yet, meme or not, Beast Mastery is now more popular than Marksmanship in the raid after getting buffed. You had Outlaw becoming the best performing rogue spec after getting buffed, and it's in the top 5 currently of overall DPS in the raid, and it's even getting more and more popular in Mythic Plus. You had Windwalker rising in the ranks after the buff, so overall the buffs have been okay. What has been missing, however, is the nerfs. We have gone too far for too long without significant nerfs. That was the point of this video rant on this Tuesday. So, with this being said, we can close today's video. Thank you guys for watching and for helping to grow the channel by also liking and commenting down below and subscribing to the channel. Obviously, this one being a rant directed at Survival and Destruction Warlock players. as a whole. Everyone who is joining me in their contempt for these two specs and in their wishes for seeing these two specs nerfed is encouraged to subscribe for today. I am also, as a side note, you can follow me up on Twitter somewhere in this direction, and you can also even more support me by subscribing to my Patreon down over here, which will also give you access to my super secret Discord channel. This one being said, okay, thank you guys again, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, my god, I have this secret allergy. Sometimes my nose is gonna start twitching and itching constantly. So annoying.